Session is going to be on EDI 810s, vendor invoices and CSD using EDI for the Electronic Transaction Control Center. And this is number 2 in our series. We'll have approximately 10 of these. And it's our professional services webinar number 73. The topics that we'll be covering in this webinar include understanding setups required for processing vendor EDI invoices, learning how to manage vendor EDI invoice errors and exceptions using the Electronic Transaction Control Center, and learning how to troubleshoot vendor EDI invoice errors using the admin ION inbox and outbox. A little bit about NSA for those that may not be familiar. We were founded in 1984. We were actually the very first reseller of the distribution Infor ERP solutions. We've committed to this particular platform and to distributors to optimize what we can in our level of expertise. We've got an average of around 15 years of our consultants and 22 plus of those, largest and most experienced team in the industry. And we focus, again, on distribution specifically and add-on solutions to your ERP to optimize it. So I'm Brian Weaver. I'm the Vice President of Sales here at NSA, and there's my contact information, and I'm your host today. And today, presenting for us is Dave Rumsch. So Dave has been with NSA since 2013. He's a senior business consultant. He has 37 years experience in wholesale distribution, including 33 working with Infor SX Enterprise and Cloud Suite software. 16 years, he's got roles as a senior business consultant, systems integration account manager, special projects manager, working with customers in the US, Canada, and Australia. He's a retired CPA in the states of Florida and Georgia. And he works with character, graphical, including SXE GUI, Web UI, and Cloud Suite. And he specializes in a number of different areas, and EDI is one of those. And I'll let Dave talk more about anything else that he'd like to add to his background. But with that, Dave, take it away.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to turn off my lovely face here. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to talk about managing vendor EDI invoices in CSD using the Electronic Transaction Control Center. I'm going to go through the slides. Should take about a half an hour, 35 minutes or so, and then we can answer questions. We've got time to actually get into the software that way. The agenda today is to go over the setups for processing vendor EDI invoices, how manage errors and exceptions in ETCC. See, I can't even say it that way. And using the ION inbox outbox to troubleshoot. Acronyms, we all love acronyms. I'm going to try to just use 3 of them here so that when our customers listen to this, they can actually understand a lot of it without a huge number of acronyms. EDI, which means the electronic data interchange. The ETCC, which is the Electronic Transaction Control Center, where decisions are made on how to deal with invoices, finding errors and exceptions. And lastly, ION, which is an intelligent open network, which is the process of sending transactions through partners and value-add networks through your software and back out to process the partner order into our software. So that's what's going to happen with the inbound invoices. We're going to go over the setups now. There are setups and administrative options, business rules, purchase order add-ons and terms, units of measure, vendor e-commerce settings, and operator security. Under administrative options, there are 2 administrative options under integrations, ION Office interface options, ION company settings, that section. You need to check the box to use the IMS ION inbox outbox. That gives you access to the troubleshooting of why an invoice might not have come in. And on the right side, we need to check the box to allow AP inbound invoice processing. And that's what allows us to process them and see them in the Electronic Transaction Control Center. You need to set up one business rule for this process. You go into the business rule setup function You're going to click New. You'll create ETCC for this business rule to create transaction audit records. This will allow the Electronic Transaction Control Center to process the transactions. Without this, you won't see those records. When you do your new setup and you're finished, it should look like this with the run value set to yes. Now let's talk about X12 standards in the industry. In 1979, the American National Standards Institute chartered the Accredited Standards Committee to develop uniform standards, X12 standards, not really an acronym, they call them X12, for inter-industry electronic exchange of business transactions. We're going to go over those standards now as they're used in the CSD software. Units of measure, purchase order add-ons, and terms are the most commonly used ones by our customers. There are others, such as ship via, terms, dates, and maybe one or two others, but they're not used very much. I've hardly seen them at all. These are the ones used most commonly. So units of measure, what needs to be set up in the software for units of measure? There's two places that you do that. One is in the generic setup of table values. And in there, you're going to set up unit conversions. For example, you might set up the 4-character DOZN always equals DZ as the EDI add-on code. So that every time you transacted business for a dozen, it already knows they'll send back and forth DZ, which will mean 12 to 1. If, however, you're using box, for example, for a unit of measure, one item may be 100 units, another might be 1,000 units. So you can't do box at the generic level. You need to do it at the specific item extended unit conversion setup. In there, I would set up a box of 1,000 for an item as BX for their EDI unit of measure code. Remember, I've only got 2 letters available. Here's some examples of the ones you might set up at the generic level. So again, we're at the table code value setups for unit conversions. Now the X12 standard requires a 2-letter EDI unit of measure code. One of the most common issues that we have is that they come in and they don't hit properly. And as a result, the accounts payable clerks in the vendor work center have to deal with fixing these on the fly. If you set them up right, they're not going to have those errors. So for example, you might set up, if you're using a 4-letter each, and you're not using a 2-letter EA as your stocking unit of measure, then EA would work at a 1-to-1. If you're also using EA, I'll give you an example of why it doesn't work. If the stocking unit of measure, if you use both EA and EACH for different products, which happens a lot in older databases. You might set up dozen, DZ, as 12-to-1. You might set up C100 as 100-to-1 and 1,000 M as 1,000-to-1. Those are common to all products, so they can be used by all products with those same 2-letter codes. Now let's look at setting those up. This is in the table count code value setup, and this is where the biggest error that I find most common in dealing with EDI unit of measures. It's the first thing I ask customers about when I'm trying to map those for them. If they set up a stocking units as EA and EACH, well, I only have 2 letters for EDI, so I'm going to make them EDI at 1-to-1. Now that works great if I'm doing outbound documents because both of those will send EA. But on the inbound document, it's going to find the first one alphabetically. So if it sees EA, it's going to use a 2-letter EA. And if you've got EACH as a stocking unit of measure, that's a miss, and it won't hit it right. It may still function, but you're going to get error messages. Here's an example of doing extended unit of measure setups. So for this item, a tool, I believe, a DeWalt tool, I order them in boxes of 10 at 10-to-1. I have EA set up at 1-to-1. I've got CS for my case of 100, and they may send me a pallet of 4,500 stocking units. Again, these are conversions to the stocking unit of measure. And here's an example of one of those being set up. So I'm in the extended unit conversion setup. I'm entering it for this drill bit. I'm doing it by the case. It has a stocking unit of measure that comes in by default from the product setup master. I say what my 2-letter EDI unit of measure code is, and I give it my description. It's 100 of units for each stocking unit, so a case is 100 eaches. Nice and simple. There is a third area of unit conversions that causes difficulties or challenges, and that is special price costing units of measure. In the product record, you can have an item that is purchased by the piece, but it's priced per 1,000 square feet or per 1,000 square inches or whatever other non-common factor is used. But again, you're selling it by the piece. This is for pricing. So you'll set up in the pricing setup under the product a special price, and you'll do your math, and it'll come out to 0.08533. Stocking units of measure to 1,000 square feet. So that's for the pricing purpose per 1,000 square feet. Now, something unusual for EDI. Notice this is a pricing conversion. Doesn't seem like I should have to do a unit conversion, right? But in fact, you do. You have to set up a specific extended unit conversion for that item per 1,000 square foot using FT. Now, the 2 letters that are going to get sent in per 1,000 feet. And notice that the conversion factor here as a fraction is the same as it is here. This is ICSP, the master product record, and this is ICSEU, excuse me for the acronyms, the extended unit conversion, and they are the same. And that's what makes this work. It's a little confusing when you're telling a buyer that they've got to set up a unit conversion for pricing, a product unit conversion, but it is required. You're going to get rounding errors because that's what that does, wound down to the 5 digits. Purchase order add-ons. Add-ons are probably in the old world in our software, if you had an add-on that wasn't set up with the X12 cross-reference, it would bang right out of the software and you would lose the invoice completely with an error message on the report. Well, today in CSD, that doesn't happen. It brings it in, you'll see that there's an error, and you'll have to go fix it, and I'll show you what the results of some of those are. So for setting up the purchase order add-ons in the generic code value setup section of the software, you choose purchase order add-ons. Here's an example of 3 of them, one for freight. An advertising allowance is a negative add-on. There are numerous negative add-ons, and this is a handling fee. Those are 3 common ones that are being set up. When you set them up, you put in your add-on code and your description and the EDI add-on code that's associated with that description. There are well over 1,000 standard X12 EDI add-on codes. 6 or 8 of them are used by most of our partners that transact business. So if you get a few of them set up, it'll solve a lot of pain. Another thing that customers do, if they're not interested in breaking down their add-ons that come in by freight or by categories, they're not expensing them into the GL, then they might use the most common one, which is David 240, D240, as the add-on code. I have some customers that I work with that do that, and others that use all of the detail that is available. Next one is payment terms codes. Now I've almost have nobody that does payment terms codes. Usually the payment terms are governed by the vendor's invoice coming in, and he'll tell you the discount percentage and the dates. So we use those specifically if the vendor is correct. If the vendor is usually wrong, then we'll use the defaults from the system, and there's a setup field in the vendor settings, and I'll show you in a second. So payment terms codes, here's some examples of the X12 standards. 02 being the end of the month, 24 meaning there's a discount, 36 meaning there's a contract. I've never ever seen that verbiage in our stuff. So these are the standards, however, if you choose the vendor and your customer choose to use those. Again, it's set up in the table code value setups. You'd set up your terms code of whatever the value is, and then here you would, that's end of month, and the code is 02, end of month 02. The next setup required, now we're getting down into the vendor management. Different accounts payable clerks may be using different vendors, and you may import them separately by vendor. Now you can set up a vendor group name at the vendor level and drive their invoices to the accounts payable work center for that AP clerk. So you might set up, mine's very generic here, in the setting up of in-vendor invoice groups. I've just set up EDI invoices, gave it my description, and set it as a one-time. I generally don't use this side because the way that the software totals debits and credits is a little bit confusing. So I tend not to use them. They'll always balance out at the end, however, or a journal won't post. So this is setting up the invoice group. And then in setting up the vendor, on the e-commerce tab, you'll see that the vendor invoice group goes right there under the process invoice settings. Going back, one of the required settings under the e-commerce is the trading partner. Now notice I've got VDR for vendor, CSD for us. Normally with the value add partners that I use, they like to have letters identifying both us, our customer, and their partners. Today, however, in CSD, I found that using the vendor partner code is good enough and doesn't really need all that cross-referencing. However, your partner may insist that they want a certain partner code. So here's where you set that. There is no table setup, no validation. You're also then in the process invoice settings under vendor setups in the e-commerce tab. Again, you're going to set your group name there. And then you're going to determine for each vendor the answers to these questions on the screen. If I check this box, that tells the system that if the EDI document has terms in it, use them, whether it's a terms code, whether it's the dates and the percentages, etc. If the EDI, you check this box and the EDI document does not have anything, it'll then use what's on the purchase order, as you may have a special transaction terms on a specific PO. And then it will default to the vendor terms themselves in the software. If you don't check this box, it's just going to use the vendor terms. So that's, again, each vendor might be different. If the terms are consistent, they're going to say uncheck it. If they vary by invoice, they're going to check it. The next question down allows us to get invoices without purchase orders. So sometimes your trade vendors might send you literature that you're not going to track in the software, and you're not going to have a purchase order for it. However, you might get charged for it, you might not. In this case, you're not going to have a PO, so you would check allow invoices without purchase orders. Most of my customers will leave that unchecked and force the system to give me an error message to say this invoice came in without a purchase order, and then they can track it down in the electronic transaction control center. The third question here relates to over receipts. So I've ordered 10. The vendor has shipped me 11. Do I want that last new item to be applied to the last suffix that's open right now for that purchase order? So it'll add that one excessive ordered to the suffix. If you don't check that, the system will create a fake suffix in the electronic transaction control center only. It won't actually create a suffix, and it'll put that item on that suffix. That will force you to delete that line in the vendor work center later and add it back under the correct suffix. The more I work with folks, the more often I find that they just want to put it on the last suffix. Every now and then I have someone who wants to isolate them a little better. The last question on this side is about setting the flag for printing notes. Now, I don't know anybody who prints a note, who prints a vendor invoice once it's in CSD. Seems to me that if they sent you notes that you wouldn't print them. What this flag does do, however, if you don't check it, it doesn't bring in the notes at all. So you want to always check that flag so that the notes will appear on the vendor invoices. The last question on the right deals with performing secondary PO line matching. This is also an administrative option that you can set at that level. If a vendor, however, is acting separately, what this does, for example, if I have a non-stock line and the vendor doesn't match the right line number and they don't match the right product number, it will try again by matching the quantity and the cost per unit of those items. And this actually works pretty well. I've watched it in total, and I often will recommend that customers check this box right here. You can make it different by vendor and let the system default govern the rest. Operator security. In setting up operator security, there's three sections. The first section is under operator security, other options, under the electronic control screen. Here, you're going to set the inbound EDI invoice. You're going to set it to allowed. That will allow your operator to be able to manage ETCC transactions in that function itself. Without this, they'll get the search menu with no values. In function security, you need to set security to two specific functions, ETCC, which is the Electronic Transaction Control Center, and this one that I never remember, although lately I seem to be remembering it, which is the inbox, outbox, and where you handle troubleshooting invoices. Both of those, depending on the operator's function, you may want to not give them delete capability and just set them to level 4. That way you can manage them yourself and decide when you want to delete them at the IT level and how you store this data long term. You should talk with your consultant about that. The last section of security, which truly surprised me, was that you had to have security to every function that starts with EDE. It took me about 6 months, but finally got the word that you had to have security to EDE, and I believe it's security level 3, not up to 5, for all of the EDE functions, or you won't get the data to do the search. I'll show you that in a second. So let's talk about using the Electronic Transaction Control Center. When you go in, you'll get the search parameters on the left, and that's what I was referring to. If you don't have security to the EDE processes, then when you come in here, this will be blank and you can't fill it in at all. When you come in here, you're going to change the process type to ION BOD. The transaction type, you're going to drop down and select the EDI810 inbound invoice. You're going to look for process transactions, and you're going to look at everything that came in. This date, I usually let it default to today's date. However, because invoices come in overnight from vendors and they might come in at 11 p.m., you might decide to change the from date to yesterday. It will default to today. Once you select search on this at the very bottom, you'll get a screen that looks something like this. Now notice I'm just looking, I've done one that's got a lot of errors, and I've got one that completed without any. So this is the status of the transaction, and this is the invoice. Now that's a mapping feature that we need to do with your value add network partner or with the vendor themselves, so that I can make sure that that document reference appears right here where you can see the invoice number easily. You'll notice here that the system, we had a total of 5 errors at the header and 5 errors at the line levels in this example here. If I drill down, if I click errors right there, it will show me a summary of what I saw on the previous screen. Now you'll notice the numbers are a little different because I'm using 2 different sessions. I apologize. In this example, however, There were 9 documents selected. Here I only had 6. I may have cut some off. 9 headers. I had 9 header problems. I've got 5 line item errors, and I've got 3 line exceptions. Errors tend to be more critical. Exceptions are more like warnings. If you ever use the graphical product, you would see that the exceptions that show up on the report and the errors also. In this case, it would say I didn't create the invoice, and in this case, it usually will say it did. In drilling down, again, I'm clicking errors. The lower section will appear at the same time. And these are those errors. So notice I've got 1 line exception and the rest are errors. This one, it says I cannot cost that line item because it's already been costed. So it's not active, so it can't cost it. You'll notice that same purchase order number in the header. The reason was it had an error that the purchase order was already closed. So it did not cost the lines, and your action will be to delete that out of the work center. This one is, again, the same invoice, purchase order rather. And when you drill down, you'll be able to see some of the details like that. Now there are 4 different invoices that have potentially that exception. The unit of measure not set up. So if it didn't match that 2-letter code, you're going to get this error at the line level. This one as well said that line didn't exist. Now, that can happen for many reasons. If I get 11 and I ordered 10, I'm going to get that kind of error, and it'll add it appropriately to the suffix or to the next suffix that it creates. That's a very common error for that. Another reason that that might happen is that several vendors have systems where they do sub-line numbers. So their line numbers will go 10, 20, 30, 40. That'll often cause this error. And usually I'll try to catch that early per vendor to make sure that the value add network partner that does the mapping divides it by 10. And that solves usually a large number of go live errors associated with line items. The next one on this list is the add-on code wasn't set up. And again, under GUI, that would crash. You'd have to re-import the transaction. In CSD, however, it comes in and you'll need to fix it in the vendor work center. We talked about that one. Here's an active transaction exists. The invoice already exists in batch, and this means it's in the accounts payable system, ready to be paid. If it said inactive transaction exists, it would have already been paid. This one says it's in a batch in the vendor work center. And then this one at the bottom occurs for 2 reasons. One of the reasons is if I've got a correction order in the middle of purchasing, it creates an RM, and then it creates another back order for the purchase order. Well, EDI can't tell the difference. So when it hits that return suffix, it'll crap out right there and say, we can't process that. It will also give you this message if it tries to process a credit and it's a PO. Let's look at some of those details now. So now when I'm on the main screen still, and if I click on the error and I drill down, I'm going to see, I apologize. I went back to the main screen. I'm looking at this invoice. I've got 2 error messages on that invoice and 1 line error. When I drill into that invoice, it says here an active transaction already exists. The purchase order is already closed and it's not active. Remember, I had those 2 errors, and I even had that one on the first screen, and they were all related to this invoice. In this case, you would make sure that it was correct, and then you would delete the invoice from the vendor center. This transaction says it's already existing in a batch. There's my invoice number. I can go to the batch. I'll show you how to do that at the end. I'll get into the software to show you that it already exists in a batch. And once you find it and confirm it, again, your action would be to delete it from the vendor invoice center. Vendor is inactive. That's a hard error at the top right there. The vendor is inactive. The result of that is usually that the invoice will not be imported. Um, uh, in this case, it looks like it did it. I'd have to say it looks like it'll bring them in. That's it. I apologize. It will bring it in. It'll be inactive. And then what do? Discuss it with your buyer, find out why the vendor's inactive. Then if you find that it needs to be reprocessed, they'll make their change to the vendor and you'll ask system admin to reprocess the order if necessary. Unit of measure errors that you'll see. So I've got 2 line errors here. Again, if I've got a quantity unit of measure, whoops, and there's pricing unit of measures, I'm going to get the same error twice because they will have sent it in both sections. If they only send in one, I'll just get it on the one. Here, you're going to go into the vendor work center, invoice center, and you're going to fix the quantity and the pricing unit of measures there. So again, you go into your work center, put in the invoice number, and you should be able to find the transaction easily. Here's the add-on code not set up. And that's a header error. Again, here it's imported, but it's going to be out of balance because if you're expensing that add-on, it couldn't find it. So it doesn't know what the expense account is. So it's going to hit the suspense account in trying to balance at the end. It'll come up out of balance. And then you'll need to correct it. So the action is to correct it. Oh, here it is. Sorry. The action is to enter the add-on on the invoice in the work center, and then you might go and set it up so that the next time you don't have that problem. You'll find your add-on code, you'll set it up, and you'll put it there if it already existed. And if it didn't, you might set up a new one. Credit not allowed, purchase orders not a return. You're going to contact your vendor to resolve. You might figure out that it's a correction order in the middle of a regular purchase order. And if that's the case, then you have to do it manually. It's not going to do it for you. Or you may remove the transaction and then enter it completely all over again. This is the same error message that you'll get if you try to process a negative line or a negative order and it's a PO, a purchase order type, not a return merchandise type. PO line number not in the purchase orders. This is again at the line level. Here's our exception for it. Now, this is apply the over receipt, under receipt. I'm sorry, over receipt of the last suffix might happen as a result of this, or it might just say, I can't find it. It'll create it fake. And then you need to work on it in the vendor invoice center and delete the lines, add them back as necessary. Again, you might go to the buyer first before doing that. Something you don't see too often, invoice amount must be greater than 0. I have seen it. The result of that is it brings in a $0 invoice. You're going to contact the vendor. You might remove the transaction from the work center and re-enter it manually. So let's go back just a sec to the inbox outbox. Your first methodology coming in is you'll use this to determine if there's any invoices that didn't come in at all. So this is resulting from the setup of the connection point and the documents to be traded and the data flow of those documents from the vendor into CSD and with certain exceptions applied to it, and then all the way through into the software. If it makes it through, if it makes it through or not, it's going to show up here. If it came all the way through with no major errors, it'll show up in the ION inbox outbox, and it'll show that there's no exceptions. However, if there are, you need to deal with those right away. Often I have customers coming here first. Coming into the inbox outbox, the search parameters screen comes up. You're going to set it to inbound. You're looking for errors only. You're looking for the supplier invoice noun, and you could leave these 2 blank and then change this to a 0 to get today or 1 to go back a day. It'll default to a 7. This is what you might see from the errors in the inbox outbox. So it finds 2 errors. Well, what are they? If I drill down, I click on that arrow and I drill down, it's going to give me the error message at the top. And in this one, the vendor doesn't allow invoices without a valid PO. So in this case, it was not imported. You need to research it. You may need IT to do that. I'll show you a little bit of that in a second in the software. Contact the vendor to resolve and then re-enter the invoice manually. The second one on my list was that the vendor wasn't set up at all. Again, it wasn't imported. You need to contact the vendor or talk to the buyer to see what's going on with that particular invoice. Okay, I'm going to go into the software now. And if you guys have had any questions, now would be a great time for that.
Hey, Dave. Yeah, we do have a couple in the chat. Did you want to address those?
Sure.
Okay, great. So, Kathy, thank you for your question. What roles do you normally see take responsibility for all the required setups? Centralized, multiple people, functional areas?
Um, it's generally centralized. However, in the IT department and with the operations branch managers, it is possible to go down to the buyer levels for them to be setting up some of their stuff related to the vendors specifically. And accounts payable people um, need to be contacted to discuss what they need for terms, what they need for the e-commerce work center defaults. So this one is for the AP clerks, because this
Okay.
area is for them right here. How do they deal with the inbound invoices? However, the buyers might need to know some of the setups because they're the ones that are doing the unit of measure setups. If a company has a pricing department, then they might be responsible for it. I think the answer to that is that the bigger the company, the more people are involved. The smaller the company, the less you need to.
Okay, great. We got two more questions for you. So, also from Kathy, what doc do we use as the approved X12 list?
Generally, the one that I send out the most is I got them online generally, is the add-on codes. And I actually have that and I send it out every time I work with a customer. So those are the add-on codes. The other ones, usually I'll go online to get them. They're not in Infor documentation.
Okay. And the last question I have for you at this time is from Valerie. Will it process negative lines if it's tied to a PORM though?
Yes, absolutely. It'll process miscellaneous RM transactions normally as negative invoices.
Great. Thank you, Dave. That's all we have for the moment.
Wow, guys. Okay, so I'm going to work around the software a little bit while we're sitting here. So if I come in first and I go to the Ion inbox outbox, I'm going to change this to inbound. I'm going to say, show me errors. I'm going to do a lookup and grab supplier invoice and change this to 1 day. Notice that you can, if you're huge, you can change that limit. There's my 2 errors for what happened in the last 2 days. I drill into this one, it says purchase orders already closed, so it did not bring in the invoice. Now, if it was something that the IT was involved in, here's a good example. PO0 is not valid. We don't allow, the vendors don't allow invoices without a PO. When IT comes in here, if you have this happen, IT should be notified and they'll come in here and copy this transaction. And I use Notes++ for this. I'm just going to do this briefly. I'm going to save the file with an XML at the end. Oh, did it do it? Nope. Silly me. You got to do it. There we go. Notice that changing it to XML makes it pretty to read. In here now, this was an error. What was wrong with it? There's my PO number. Here's my vendor. Here's my invoice number. So from right there, you have the information that you need to find out what's going on with that purchase order and that invoice. Once you and whoever else is involved figure out what to do, the IT department can take this transaction and reprocess it through your system, or you can enter it manually. Please note that I always ask my AP clerks that I'm training to get PDF copies of invoices, whether they're sent directly from the vendor, or if not, that the value add partner, such as Unilink is who we use often, LBMX is another, there are more, to send a PDF to an AP inbox so that you've got a copy of all the PDFs that went through the system and you can validate them if you have to. Other folks may want to log into the vendor system to look at them. I like getting hard copies. So let's go back. Any questions on inbox, outbox? Well, I got you all. Cool. ETCC, after I've gone and looked here, and I'm only going to do that a little bit. We had a conversation yesterday, for example, with a customer who said, who should do this? And we spent about 10 minutes having the conversation of, should IT do this or should it be the operators? And I suggested to them that the operators should be able to come in to see the errors, but it should stop there. Or they have a central area that looks at all of these transactions and manages them and have instructions on how to manage them. So you'll notice, no, I wouldn't have them here. I was on that customer system, and when I displayed all the errors here, I had some that were invoices, some were there other transactions that dealt with the warranty process software, and 2 or 3 others. So IT needs to work with the various departments to make sure they know what to do when they see errors in here. I do not recommend that a buyer take it further than, or an AP clerk further than about right here to see the errors. In ETCC, never hurts to look at this more. I go ION BOD, 810I inbound invoice. Now I can look at everything that came in, or I can just look at the errors. And generally, I'm going to do it this way first. I think I started a few days ago, so I'm going to change my date range. And you'll notice I got a whole bunch of process transactions that had errors here. That's only because I only did things that have errors in my training world. But generally speaking, you might have 302 errors, right? And then you're sorting to find the errors. So I tend to tell people, change the transaction status to error to start with. You'll get less of, I'm sorry, wrong one, got that wrong. Update status to error. There we go. Now notice in this screen, and that's the same screen we were looking at in my in the PowerPoint, here's my invoice numbers. I can sort right here and get them in order. Here, where's my vendors? Yeah, I got to drill down for the here's my vendors. Sorry. Right there, 16, 17, and 18 that I'm working with. I've got a bunch of different header errors. I've got one header exception. You can move these around. Remember, try to group these well so that you can see everything on the screen. If I click errors after that, I can see there's 11 documents that had errors. And notice I had 18 line items among the 11 documents that had unit of measure errors. Excuse me. Apologies, guys. So I've got 18 different transactions there that have those errors. If I drill down, this isn't the easiest thing to do, to figure out which documents these are and which invoices they are. So once I get past this, I'll stop. I'll go back and get the invoice and look at it in detail. So 10889 is the ID. 10889, this one right here. Notice the invoice number is over here, but it wasn't on the other one. The PO number is not on either one. So you've got to get used to using some of the document IDs to get the data. We work real hard to get as much as we can into the reference fields so that you have PO and invoice number data here. It's possible we could get the PO number there as well. Now, if I drill down, I can see what the problems are with the header of that invoice. Notice I've got 2 header errors and 2 line errors and 1 line exception and 1 line error. That's all on this one invoice. Here's my header errors. So that's my $0 invoice. It was already imported. And by the way, it had unit of measure issues. Couldn't find the line item. And because it couldn't find the line item, it had a bad unit of measure. Now, that particular one we would have found early on and have determined that it was a copy of another duplicate batch. I believe that's correct. Let's look at that again. Yeah, it already exists in a batch. So how do I find that in the batch, right? There's my invoice number. And here's my vendor, 1016. So if I go APECE, I'm into the, excuse the acronym, the vendor work center. I do show more. I put in my vendor. I put in my invoice. Notice that I left the batch group blank. I'm going to turn that off really quick. Sorry, guys. And now I can see that there it is twice in 2 different batches. It's 0 both times. I'm going to delete the one, and I'm going to go back and work the other one and find out why it came in as 0. So that's how you would find an invoice in a batch when it says it's already there. Again, I did in my vendor invoice center, no group, unless I know the group that that vendor goes in, enter the vendor and the invoice. Okay, back to my error screen. Invoice must be greater than 0. That's probably the one we were just working on. Already exists in a batch. There are 7 of those errors. And it looks like they might be different. They are different invoices. So this tells me that I processed the stuff a whole bunch of times. Right? They exist in various batches. You're not going to get that very often, only when you get someone messing around like I've been doing. There's our vendor is inactive, which we saw in the IN inbox outbox. Here's the add-on code one. Again, I can get down into the detail. Notice that's the same add-on code for 2 different documents from that same vendor, 1016 here. Notice that one's a vendor inactive. That was interesting. Let me do that again. The add-on codes twice. I did it differently to get the inactive on the same screen. This is the purchase order is not a return. So if I go and I say PO number 879, and I look at history, and I can see that I have returns. See, I've had correction orders a couple of times. It cannot do this electronically. The software cannot. That's a good place to do an enhancement request for Infor and get folks to vote for it. That's a pretty big one. And the other one was 881. I think it's the same thing. See if that's correct. It's regular PO. Second, history. That one's probably just a mess up of me of how I set it up. I apologize. Normally that you would see that would be a return order. And then inactive transaction exists with this one. So that means it's in accounts payable already, right? So in that case, I'm going to look at vendor 1017 or 10891, 10891, vendor 1017, invoice 2405072. So now I go to APIV, accounts payable, inquire on vendors, 1017. That's interesting. Go. And it shows that it's inactive in the software right there. Any questions on anything else we've seen? Are there, oh, several. Okay.
Yep, we got a couple, Dave. So, Kathy, thanks again for asking away here. Have you noted any volume issues with EDI in? For example, 100 invoices, 1,000 invoices. Is there, I guess, a degradation at some level?
I'll tell you, surprisingly, I have found hundreds of invoices without a problem. Thousands, not too often, but I don't see it as a problem. They process well through Ion. It does a really good job of tracking them and giving details of what it did with each invoice. So I don't know much degradation in the software for large volume.
Okay, great. And then another question, and you certainly showed a lot of navigation and drill-ins, but are there report exports for these or is it the grid report itself? It
Yeah,
looks
you
like.
really need to use the grid. There are let me think about that. You could run an update on the batch that you're doing in the vendor work center and say don't update. So if you did APEGU, which is the batch update function, let me think about that for a minute. Yeah, that's right. Hmm. So right here, you can say edit right there, say no. And that'll give you most of the problems that you're running into. And I would check yes to everything so that you could get the detail. That's the only real exception report that I know how to use without just coming in and doing a selection and loading it to Excel. Um, if you're doing high volume, then you're going to do that on the electronic transaction control center.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dave. So I'll just give everybody one final chance here. If anyone has any remaining questions before we kind of wrap things up, we'll give it just a little bit. And while we're waiting on that, just as a quick reminder, we will be getting the recording out to everybody on the call today. So thank you all for taking the time to attend. We really appreciate that. And Dave, I want to thank you for all your hard work in putting this together. This was a lot of depth that you went into on the 810s, and really, really appreciated.
And here's the next steps, guys, for you to say to your customers, you know, I apologize. I should have done this first, Brian. Document your vendors. What do they send today? What are you getting through EDI, or what do they want to do? Interview the AP folks to figure out any issues they may be having with EDI today. Research solutions using the tools available in CSD, and reach out to our friendly consultants to plan and implement the process to improve it for the handling of vendor EDI invoices. This is our series schedule for the rest of the EDI sessions that we're going to do. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, guys, and that's a wrap.